The Electoral College is of course the method in which the President of the United States and the Vice President is elected to their posts, and it's also gone through a lot of changes in the last 60 to 70 years. Much of these changes really show how divided the country is and how certain issues can be looked at through this prism. So that's what we're going to be doing tonight. So we're going to start with the 1960 presidential election. Now we'll start at 1960 because it's really the start of the modern era of American politics, and it shows the importance of the map changes from this date in particular. So here's what we have in 1960. We have President John F. Kennedy, well soon to be President John F. Kennedy, running for election. He's running against former Vice President, or I guess current Vice President, Richard M. Nixon. So here we can see the Electoral College map is one that looks extremely different to what we're used to. We see a blue wall in the south, and states like California, Oregon, and Washington are red, which is not what we're used to. So this election is significant. Kennedy won against all odds, really. He won by a very close amount, and he made history with being one of the youngest presidents ever elected, as well as the first Catholic president. So states that are significant here are New York, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and Texas. These are states that Democrats did not win in the last two presidential elections, in 1956 and in 1952. So Kennedy had quite an upset victory here. But let's move on. This is the 1964 presidential election. We have President Lyndon Johnson, president after, of course, John Kennedy was assassinated, running against Barry Goldwater of Arizona. Now, as you can see, this election was a landslide, blue all around. It remains one of the biggest victories for the Democratic Party in history. And again, this map is almost unrecognizable, except for one thing, the Republican dominance in the South. Now, this is extremely important because it marks the first time that states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina were won by the Republican Party since the Civil War. Formerly, those states were Democratic strongholds and represented by extremely conservative Southern Democrats, or Dixiecrats, in the United States Congress. This election is also significant because to this day it remains the only election to see Alaska vote Democrat. It also marks the last time that Idaho, Kansas, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Utah, and Wyoming voted for the Democratic Party. Moving on to the 1968 election. Now this election was extremely contentious in America, which probably is reflected by the map that you see. The first thing to note is that many southern states did not vote for a Democrat or a Republican, but instead voted for George Wallace, who was a Southern Democrat and a proponent of segregation. Now, to explain this, you need to understand that President Lyndon Johnson had just passed the Civil Rights Act, which was a momentous law for a number of reasons, but it was also heavily opposed in the South, and Southern Democrats were furious that one of their presidents had passed this. We'll come back to this later, but this is an extremely important watershed moment in American politics. As you can see, President Richard Nixon won a handy majority of the Electoral College, carrying some southern states such as South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, as well as Florida, as well as some states that had voted Democratic in the previous election. Moving on again to 1972, and we have a sea of red. This marks Richard Nixon's first election to the office of president, absolutely thrashing the Democratic nominee George McGovern. You can see this in the massive 520 electoral vote majority that President Nixon managed to get. As you can see, Massachusetts and the District of Columbia were the only two jurisdictions not to vote for the Republican ticket, a situation which famously resulted in the bumper stickers "Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts" after President Nixon's resignation. It also marks the first time Texas voted Republican in a number of elections. Now, moving on to the 1976 election, and this election was, of course, in the aftermath of Richard Nixon's resignation, which, of course, saw Gerald Ford become president. Now, this is a very interesting map because it looks like a much older electoral map. The Democrats are back in control of the South, and the Republicans are back in control of the West Coast. This can mostly be attributed to the fact that Jimmy Carter, who would go on to become president after this election, was a Southerner. He was from Georgia. And as a local Southern boy, he obviously attracted a lot of Southern votes. With, of course, the clear exception of Virginia there, the lone Southern holdout from the Democratic Party. What's also interesting about this election is the division we see in the New England region. We see states like Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Maryland vote Democrat, as well as New York. And we see states like New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and Connecticut, as well as New Jersey, vote Republican. Now, moving on to the 1980 election, and this is where President Ronald Reagan was first elected, defeating incumbent President Jimmy Carter. Now, this election is often called a realignment election because it really sets the stage for the modern Republican Party. You can see the Republicans are completely dominant in the South with the exception of Georgia. Again, we can probably put that down to Jimmy Carter coming from that state. And Republicans have won nearly every other state with the exception of Minnesota, West Virginia, Maryland, and Rhode Island. And of course the District of Columbia. And Hawaii. How could I forget Hawaii? Even Massachusetts, who famously did not vote for Richard Nixon, voted for President Reagan. So take note of those states, Minnesota, West Virginia, and Rhode Island in particular, because in the 1984 election, President Reagan managed to sweep the board with those two, with the sole exception of Minnesota and the District of Columbia. He even won Hawaii, a complete landslide election. Now, importantly, this election also marks the last time that Washington, Oregon, New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Hawaii voted for a Republican candidate for president. So let's move on to the 1988 election. President Reagan was ineligible to run for a third term, and so we have Vice President George H.W. Bush running against Michael Dukakis. And once again, it is a landslide for the Republican Party, although not as convincing as the 1984 election. Notably, we have the states of Washington and Oregon turning blue for the first time in a couple of elections, as well as West Virginia returning to the Democratic fold. We also have New York returning Democrat, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and the District of Columbia, as well as Wisconsin, who had actually voted Republican for a couple of elections, Iowa with the same, and of course Minnesota. Minnesota seemed to be the sole blue holdout through the 80s for the Republican Party. Once again, note the division in the New England area. We have Massachusetts and Rhode Island voting Democrat, as well as New York, with the majority of the other New England states voting Republican. This election also marked the last time that California, Illinois, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, Vermont, and Maine voted for the Republican Party. Okay, let's move on to the 1992 election. And here we have another complete realignment election. You can see the Democrat candidate Bill Clinton, who was of course running against George H.W. Bush, who was running for his second term. We see Clinton winning significant support in the Old South, winning states like Georgia, Louisiana, and Arkansas, as well as Tennessee and Kentucky. He also completely dominated on the West Coast, winning Washington and Oregon once again for the Democrats, as well as California and Nevada for the first time in several election cycles. He also won Montana, which is an extremely important state to note, as well as Colorado. Notably, he also did a clean sweep of the New England area, so we see those divisions from the old elections going away. This election marked the last time that Montana voted for a Democrat candidate, and also Georgia until 2020. Moving on to Bill Clinton's re-election year, in which he ran against Republican nominee Robert Dole. And we can see an almost identical map, with the exception of Montana again swinging Republican, as well as Georgia. And in their place, Clinton won Arizona. Again, Clinton's dominance of the West Coast is very comprehensive, as well as in the New England area. But once again, we see significant opposition to Clinton from the Republican-held South. Clinton did manage to win Louisiana and Arkansas, as well as Florida, but in the process he lost Georgia. This election marked the last time that Missouri, Louisiana, Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky, Arizona, and West Virginia voted for a Democratic Party candidate, with the exception of Arizona, who voted Democrat in the 2020 election. Interestingly, 1996 was the first time that the Democrats had won the state of Arizona since 1948. Okay, moving on to the 2000 election, which was the closest election in American political history. We have George W. Bush winning his first term as president, defeating Al Gore by 2 Electoral College votes. So that's a final tally of 271 to 266, an extremely close election. I won't get into all the politics of the Florida recount, but it was controversial to say the least. Now, this election can pretty much be upheld as another realigning election. This electoral map remains extremely close to the kind of electoral map that we see in recent presidential elections. We have complete Republican control of the South, complete Democratic control of the New England area as well as the West Coast, with the slight exception of New Hampshire there, as well as the Rust Belt states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Moving on to the 2004 presidential election, we have George W. Bush running for re-election against John Kerry. Now, George W. Bush won re-election slightly more convincingly than last time, but it was still a rather close election. Here we can see New Hampshire flipping back to the Democratic column. In its place, the Republicans won Nevada, as well as New Mexico and Iowa. Now, the 2004 presidential election was the last time that New Mexico, Colorado, and Virginia voted for a Republican candidate for president. Let's move to the 2008 presidential election. This election might be one that stands out in many minds because of its historic significance. We, of course, had the first African-American president in Barack Obama elected. He was running against John McCain. And he won by a pretty convincing 365 Electoral College votes to 173. Firstly, Obama swept the board with most of the swing states, with the exception of Missouri, which he lost very narrowly. Obama also won Virginia, which hadn't voted for a Democratic candidate for president for over 50 years, as well as North Carolina, which hadn't voted Democrat since 1976. Obama actually also won the 2nd Congressional District's vote in Nebraska, which was the first time that state has split its Electoral College votes. And it's also the first time Nebraska has given an Electoral College vote to a Democrat since 1964. Of course, Nebraska and Maine are the only two states that split their Electoral College votes amongst their districts. All other states have a winner-takes-all formula. 2008 was also the first time Democrats had won the state of Indiana since 1964. Okay, so let's move on to the 2012 presidential election, which of course had Barack Obama running for re-election against Mitt Romney. This election was very similar to the 2008 election, with a few exceptions. So Obama managed to almost recreate his 2008 map, with the exception of Indiana and North Carolina, which were reclaimed by the Republican Party, as well as that one Electoral College vote from Nebraska. Okay, so let's move on to the 2016 election, which of course had President Donald Trump running for election against Hillary Clinton. Now, this was quite an interesting election again. Trump managed to sweep the industrial Midwest, winning states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania for the first time since 1988. He also managed to capture large numbers of swing states such as Florida and North Carolina for a robust but if not inspiring 304 Electoral College votes to Hillary Clinton's 227. And finally, we have our most recent presidential election, the 2020 presidential election. Joe Biden managed to take back all of the industrial Midwest states that Donald Trump had won, such as Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. He did not win Ohio, however, or Florida, which are states that often go to the victor of presidential elections. However, Biden was able to win the state of Georgia and the state of Arizona, which no Democratic candidate, including Obama, had won since the 1990s. He also managed to get back that one Electoral College vote from Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District, although Donald Trump, as in 2016, which I should have mentioned, won the 2nd Congressional District of Maine. Overall, it was almost an exact mirror image of the 2016 election, with Joe Biden winning 306 Electoral College votes to Donald Trump's 232. Okay guys, that's all I have for you tonight. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video useful, please make sure to leave a like on it or subscribe to the channel for more political videos. We'll be back with some more videos soon and deep dives into politics, but for now, good night.